Hey everyone, it's Mark. Some of you might know me, some of you might not. I'm one of the teachers for Your Yoga Flow, and I'm just hanging on like 30 seconds before we start because it's technically not 10 a.m. my time, 8 a.m. Pacific time, and then different times in other parts of the world. But here we are today. It's one of our weekly live development sessions. Every week we have a live development session with one of the faculty members. It rotates time and day and faculty member each week. And it's generally an opportunity for a faculty member to expand on a concept in a teacher training program or to offer different types of practices, ideas, a whole host of things, but they're really great opportunities for students to kind of move a little deeper into areas that interest them, which is great. So I thought that today I would talk about something fairly important if you're in the part of a program that involves class planning. And I've decided to do this as a 3-part series. So this is part 1 of 3 parts, dividing a yoga class into 3 parts. I'm calling the opening, the first part, the peak, the second part, and then the closing, the third part. And each of these parts share similarities. There's things that make them similar, things that make them quite different. And I think it's helpful to talk a little bit more in depth about each of them. And hopefully some of this is helpful, not just for planning practicums, but also if you're out there teaching and you're looking to sort of create a certain vibe or intention for your classes, then I think the opening of a class is really critical. So I have some notes, so I'll be reading my notes and presenting a few ideas for consideration. You might hear my dog moving in and around. He likes to be near cameras, so he usually shows up at some point in the duration of a live. So the opening of a class. So the most important part of a yoga class, I think, at least for me, because it's setting the scene for the class, the opening gives us a sense of our students, how they're feeling, how they're maybe starting to move a little bit, breathe a little bit. It also is the opportunity to create the container and the foundation for the entire practice. So sort of essentially we are setting the scene for how the rest of the class might go. So in that sense, it's very, very important. But I think actually the beginning and the opening of a class starts before you start your class. So in the few minutes prior to beginning the practice is really where our job as yoga guides, yoga teachers, begins. So some things that I like to do are to arrive early. I think we always talk about that, and I mean, arrive early means different things to different people. For me, I like to be there in the space about 15 minutes prior so that I can put on music, get my props ready. And also I find that me being in the space earlier as students begin to arrive, if possible, I know that's not always possible where you're teaching, but me being there early helps me to set the energy for the space that I want to create. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but for example, if I'm looking to teach a class that is very energetic, that is very upbeat, that's very high energy, then I want to be in that space early to create that vibe through my interactions with students, through the way I'm moving around the space, through the music that I'm putting on, through the setup. same thing if I'm looking to create a class that's very calm, that's quite gentle and soft and introspective, then that's the energy that I want to be creating in the space, moving about the space, even just the speed that I'm walking and the interactions that I'm having with students. All of that helps to create what it is that I'm hoping the practice is. So, you know, there's times where we, as an example, as a teacher, where I've taught a class and it's not gone the way that I've wanted. And initially I've thought, oh, it just maybe that some students who were in the class maybe just weren't jiving with it, or that there was maybe a little bit of a miscommunication. But I think in reality, it comes down to me and my role as a teacher and guide to set the intention, the space, and the energy. So this is pre-class. So pre-class, what I would suggest to do is to set up your mat and your props the way that you want your students to. This is helpful for a few reasons. One, it makes us look organized, that we know what we're doing. And also little things like, if I know that we're going to be using the blocks at the top of the mat for a warrior 3 or for a triangle, then I'm not going to put my props at the back of the mat or leave them messily sort of on either side. I'm going to put them exactly where I know we're going to need them and hopefully use them. Also, if you can, sort of orienting your mat in a way that you have a nice overall view of the whole space. I was in the mentorship program, we have two live sessions each month, and in one that happened over the weekend with the mentorship students, I talked about a class setup that I think is not so common, but was quite common where I was teaching, in a city I was teaching, and specifically in a studio that I was teaching. And it was where in the classroom, the mats point in on either side. So there's an aisle down the middle. The teacher's here at the top of the aisle, and the students are on either side pointing in towards each other. So half of them pointing in this way, half of them pointing in this way. It took me a while to get used to that sort of class setup, but as a teacher, it became quite easy because I didn't have to think about demoing too much on either side. Everybody could very likely see me. I had a whole aisle to walk up and down, and I felt connected to both sides equally. So little things like this, like the way that you arrange your students in a class. So for example, in a traditional sort of maybe traditional yoga type class setup, we have the teacher at the front. Maybe your mat is lengthways or it's this way, and then the students are at the back. I find that that's quite a long distance sometimes depending on the space, so I really liked that setup. And it's something you can try if you have a group of students you're teaching and you just want to kind of mix it up a little bit. You could try changing the space a little bit. The other thing is to, we're saying arrive early, so be present, smile, engage, ask questions. I like to do a short check-in with everybody if I can. It depends if there's like 50 people. Obviously that's not possible, but generally I would not have that many people in a class. So I'd be able to just do a quick check-in. And my check-in was, hey, how are you today? How are you feeling? That was pretty much, and if I got a response, oh, I'm fine, thanks. Or, you know what, my knee's been bugging me, or I had a stressful morning. And but generally they were just short little moments. Those are helpful because if anybody did have an issue, we could address it then and there. Like, oh, hey, I just heard I can't invert. And maybe I planned a whole practice of inversion. So we have that conversation, we figure out some stuff between us, and then hopefully we're good. So I think it helps to have that moment. You're not always going to be able to, but to get into the practice of just doing a check-in, especially if there's new people, new students, really helpful just to engage with them, find out their experience of practice, and then go from there. I'd like to put music on, so pre-class, I put the music on that I'm going to be using for the class, and I put it at a nice level. Not that it's so loud that you can't hear or converse, but that it's at a fairly reasonable level, that it kind of feeds into that energy that I'm looking to create. So those are sort of my pre-class considerations, and I think, at least for me in my teaching experience, they are so important. The same goes if you're teaching online. It's a little bit different if you're teaching, for example, a Zoom class, or you're filming your practicum class. So these are things to consider, but even for a Zoom class, I like to log in early. I like to check in with my students. I have my setup the way that I want it so that they can see, you know, little things like you can keep your camera on, you could turn it off. We still set the environment. I usually don't play music on Zoom because it is weird with cutting in and out with the speaking voice, but you could create a playlist on Spotify or Apple Music and send that to your students and they're welcome to play it. So that's pre-class. Okay, now we're getting into the meat of it, the meat of this part one, which is the opening. How do we start? How do we start a yoga class? So one thing to consider is the position that we start a yoga class in. Are your students going to be seated? Are they going to be lying down? Are they maybe in a child's pose shape? Those are sort of the three opening positions, poses that I would commonly most likely use. There might be others, I'm not sure, but I would say sitting, lying down, and sometimes child's pose are sort of more common ways to begin. There's no right or wrong way to begin a yoga class. There's different ways, and some will resonate more with others and less with others, but I really like lying down and having my students lie down at the start of a class. I don't necessarily call it Shavasana, and for the purposes of a practicum, this would not count as Shavasana. Shavasana is at the end. You can call it Shavasana if you want to say we're going to start in a short Shavasana. I like lying down because I find it's a really nice way to shift from the external outside world to the internal, more connected to our experience of what it's like to be us in that moment world. I know that when I began teaching, when I first started teaching yoga, I would feel a little shy of having students sit and look at me as I started the class. So I did get into the habit of having them lie down, I think initially as a way to not have to look at people because I was quite nervous. But then as time went on, I just found it was sort of a nice way to begin. If I do have people sitting, I do mostly invite people to close their eyes. It could just be me and a sort of a shyness that I have, but I don't really enjoy having people stare at me while I'm starting a yoga class. I could be alone in that, or there might be other people who feel the same way. But what I started to do after a few years was just give the option for both. So I would say, you're welcome to begin this class lying down, or you might choose to come to a comfortable seated position, whichever feels better for you. Now, the most important thing when we're offering options at the opening of a yoga class, but throughout an entire practice that I love to really drive home, is the importance of speaking to the people we give the option to. What does that mean? For example, I say you're welcome to sit or lie down to begin the class. We start the class, I give add my little blurb about the theme, and then I have in my sequence planned some lying down poses. And if I start doing those poses like thread the needle or twist, supine twist, things like that, but I don't take the time to talk to the people who are sitting and to bring them down onto their back, that's going to leave people out, and it leads to confusion, and it leads to a lack of cohesiveness and community in a yoga practice. So whether you're doing this at the opening of a class or whether you are giving an option later on in the practice, it's really, really important to speak to that option as you start transitioning or moving into the next pose. For that reason, if I'm opening my yoga class and I'm offering the option, I would say, you're welcome to come to a comfortable seated or lying down position, however feels best to you to start this practice today. We will be doing some movement lying down on the back after the opening of the class, and I will be cueing you down to your back if you are seated. You can do it like that. Let people know where they're going, where we're going to be ending up, because some of those people might think, well, if we're going to be lying down anyway, maybe I'll lie down. Or if we're going to be sitting anyway, maybe I'll sit for a few minutes. But this is like so critical in creating an accessible yoga practice, is speaking to any options that you give that are going to require a little bit of a different transition or movement. So, because nobody wants to feel left behind. The other thing to think about is, how long are you going to sit for, or how long are you going to be lying down for? Sitting for many is really difficult. I know that for the practicum classes, lots of time our suggestion is get some stuff out the way to begin with. If you're nervous about teaching your meditation, your pranayama, these kind of things, your mudra, your mantra, you can do it all at the beginning. What sometimes that ends up being or looking like is that students can be sitting for like 15 to 20 minutes without a break. So and of course you're so welcome to do that, because we know this is your first class. We know that getting those things checked off the list helps with nerves a whole bunch. And you can then move on to the asana, the movement portion, without having to think about those things. So totally get that. Add in the odd leg stretch for people if they're going to be sitting for more than a few minutes. What that means is you're sitting, you've opened your class, you've had a few moments to breathe, to get centered, and then you say, we're going to continue sitting. So just for a moment, we're going to shake out the legs. You might choose to change the position that you're sitting in. You might choose to lie down if it's seeming like sitting is not working for you today. And then you come back to seated, you do the meditation. You may do just like a simple kind of windshield wiper with the legs after, just to shake them out. And then you come back to seated and you do your pranayama, this kind of thing. So break it up. It's very difficult to sit for, well, it's difficult for me to sit for, 10, 15, 20 minutes without any sort of stretch. And that's sometimes the feedback on the practicums is the opening was great, but you had your students sitting for 20 minutes without any adjustment in the body. So just something to keep in mind as a teacher, break it up a little bit. I think critically at the beginning, in this opening of a yoga class, so we've decided how the students are going to be beginning, what position they're going to be in. And it's a position that makes sense for the subsequent portions of the class. If you are planning to have your students on the back anyway to do some stretches, maybe it makes sense to just start lying down. Or if you're planning to do seated poses, maybe it makes sense to just start in a seated position. Or if you're doing tabletop-y stuff, then child's pose. Child's pose is sometimes a really nice option for the opening of the class. However, there are some implications we want to think about, like people with knee discomfort, ankle, hip, people who shouldn't be inverting, because technically we're in a little bit of an inversion in child's pose. So you want to offer props if you're going to be there for a few minutes, and definitely you're not going to be staying in child's pose for too long. This really is just the first couple of moments at the beginning of a class. So, if you have a group of people they love being in child's pose for 2 minutes, which sometimes happens in like a yin or in a supported version in a restorative class, that's fine. But I think that's leads to something else, which is to try these things. So if you're thinking, I'm going to start my class in child's pose and I'm going to do this in child's pose, then you need to try that in your own body to make sure that it makes sense and that it feels good, because hopefully that means it will feel good for most of your students. Not all, we can't say all, but for many of them. So we know how we're starting, we know the position we're starting in, we sort of roughly know how long we're going to be there, so we can add in any stretches as we need to. The next thing to think about is breath. So we've come into our seating position, or we're lying down. What is it we do? We could launch into our theme. We could just, here's our yoga class, here's what's happening, here's the philosophical or the grounding theme that we have for the class. But I found in my own experience that taking a few moments, we don't even have to call it pranayama, but taking a few moments of breath is really helpful to settle the students in the energy. All that means is you can invite people to close their eyes and just notice your breath. You might take a couple of deep breaths here and just see how it feels in your body to breathe today. And that just starts to help settle the busy minds. We've been running in from somewhere to get to a yoga practice. And if my first thing I say, okay, sit and close your eyes, and we're going to talk about ahimsa, and my mind's still somewhere else. My mind's not in the space yet. So bring the students into the space through just a few breaths. It might lead into your pranayama. It might not, but just a couple of breaths. And then what I like to do is to introduce the theme. It's a short, concise theme. So it's not, I'm not going to give a dissertation for 5 minutes on the root chakra, because we need to think about the time we have in total and also people's attention span. You know, people came likely to move, to stretch, to kind of get a sense of their bodies, and not to maybe sit and hear me speak for too long of a time. So I like to keep it roughly around 2-ish minutes to just introduce the theme. I pepper the theme throughout the rest of the class, and we'll talk about that through the subsequent sessions too. But we're just planting a seed. That's what I like to think about this. It's just a seed. We don't have to have a clear, complete picture of everything, but just a seed. So for example, a theme I use a lot is mindfulness. So we could be sitting with our eyes closed, and I will say, just notice how you're breathing at this moment. Give people a few moments to notice how they're breathing. And mindfulness is the awareness of something as it's happening. And it has this beautiful ability to bring us into the present moment. So if your mind is wandering and your mind is spinning, mindfulness is an opportunity and a practice to change that pattern of thinking and to really be in the present moment. Maybe leave a little moment of space for them. And then I'll tie it into the class. As we move throughout this class today, we'll have opportunities to practice mindfulness, to practice noticing what's happening at any given moment. And you can take this practice and apply it throughout the whole yoga class, through your life outside of the yoga class. And it becomes a really lovely way to connect and to have a relationship with ourselves. Something like that. It doesn't have to be too long. You might have a longer theme sometimes or a shorter theme, but just sort of an example. You don't even have to say that this is the theme. So I just talked about mindfulness and didn't really say it's officially this theme for this class. So some classes don't have a theme. It's just an invitation to practice, and you might pepper some seeds of wisdom throughout. So we've talked about our short little theme. And then what I like to do is just leave a couple of moments of quiet. This is a great moment to move into your meditation if that's something you're including in your class, or your pranayama if that's something that's being included at the beginning of the class, but also just a couple of moments of quiet. And you can just suggest to students, it's going to take a couple of moments here to continue noticing our breath and to continue to settle into our bodies and our minds. Just 30 seconds, a minute, let the theme land. Let the theme sort of sink in. and settle. And then, depending if you're doing the meditation or pranayama at this point, then you would stretch out the legs, give them a little bit of a shake out, and then you might move into the movement. Sometimes we get the question especially for the 200-hour practicum, can I include stretches that aren't part of the asana? And the answer is yes. We didn't include stretches in the asanas because they're different for everybody, and there's a great variety of them, and they're fairly intuitive and natural for us to do. I always like to kind of do the neck stretch thing here, or we can even just do little things like this, stretches to awaken the body, just like you would do after a really nice nap. And then we're moving into the stretches and then the warm-up poses for the class. So I find this is a really great moment, especially if you're teaching a vinyasa practice, to begin to link breath and movement together. So like tabletop cat-cow, start to guide your students into how to link breath and movement. Even in a hatha class, this is so helpful, even if you're not moving with each inhale and exhale. But start to link movement and breath together, and you can continue to weave your theme in. So you can continue to speak about your theme through the warm-up, through the opening parts of the practice. One of the reasons I do this is because it's not as, I don't want to say complicated, but it's not as tricky for me to teach, a tabletop cat-cow. Sometimes I will say, I will demo a few rounds, guide students, and then continue on your own for about the next 7 breaths. And then I could bring in, because I've given them space for 7 breaths, to move at their own pace roughly, then I have time to weave in my theme. It's a bit more difficult if I'm trying to cue revolved half moon at the peak of the class to kind of work the theme in sometimes. So finding those spaces, especially in the opening and then in the cool down of the practice where you can bring and work the theme in, helps the class to feel connected. It's not just theme at the beginning and then nothing. So being really smart and kind to yourself about when you choose to bring these things in. So the time just flew, which is amazing. And Anne-Marie just had a comment that I never thought of starting in child's pose. Lots of great options for knees, wide, lots of arm positions. Yeah, one thing I like to do if I'm teaching a shoulder opening class, and I know that most students might be able to do this, is I do the child's pose with the arms forward, the hands in prayer, and then bending at the elbows to bring the thumbs to the nape of the neck, just to start gently opening up the shoulders. So you're in sort of this position in child's pose is really nice. Or if you're doing a practice, you sort of what the anatomical sort of theming of your practice is around the side body, then doing the child's pose with the hands on either side, just to start opening up the sides of the body, also an option. So that's sort of it. I have a couple of maybe pitfalls to watch out for, things that I learned the hard way in my own teaching. And the number one thing is we spoke about, which is sitting for too long. So just be aware, be mindful of how long your students are sitting for the opening of your class. Speaking too much at the start of the class, your theme is, yes, it's so important, but find creative ways to work it into the whole practice, and think about this just as really planting a seed for the practice at the beginning. And then the last thing is not setting the environment you want to cultivate. So, if you arrive last minute and your students are all there waiting, and then you rush in through the doors and you start the class, it's a little I don't want to say off-putting, it can be a little unnerving for students. You're not there to support them getting ready, to answer questions. So yeah, being early really is important, within reason. You don't need to be there half an hour early unless you love to be, but just making sure you're there to control the space and to set up the space beforehand. So this is part 1. Part 2, we're going to be talking about the peak of the class. So I like to think about the class having an arc. And so we've started the arc here. We're moving up. We sort of stopped about here at the warm-up poses, and then so part 2, we're going to be talking about the structure for the peak part of the class as we come down towards the cool down, and then part 3 will be cool down, shavasana, closing, and then end. So that is sort of it. If you are doing your practicum and you're wondering about this sort of class structure for your practicum class, just pop something in the comments. We love answering the comments. So if you're wondering, does this work? Might this work? Could I do this? Just pop it in. Really easy to answer those. And hopefully some of this information was useful for some people. So thank you for joining me. This really flew by. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks with part 2. Take care. Bye.